Hello, I'm David Van Zummer, and welcome to a message on the book of Genesis. This is the first book that we're looking at in this Bible survey series that I'm working on. So let's get into it. So, the purpose of this series, a Bible survey that I'm doing, as I discussed in the last message, the introduction to a Bible survey, is I want to give you an overview of each of the books in the Bible. That means I want to give you some information like the who, what, when, where, why, all of those cool little factoids that will hopefully be able to give you a big picture of the Bible, help you put all of the biblical pieces together when you're reading the Bible, hopefully on a daily basis, you'll have a better understanding of what's being said. You'll have a grasp of where that falls into the greater scheme, the big picture of the Bible, and hopefully you'll be able to apply what you're reading into your daily life a little bit easier. So let's get into it. Genesis, first book of the Bible, right? And so we're going to look at who wrote Genesis, first piece of information for the book. Right? So I think it's interesting to know that when we look at Genesis and the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, we should realize that it was really one big book. Originally, it was one book that Moses wrote. I gave it away, right? Uh, most people believe, I mean, the popular theory is that Moses wrote the Pentateuch, right? But the separation into separate books, and in those books, the separation into chapters and verses is something that we've done since it's been written, right? Modern era people we've put in verses and chapters and books to make it easier to read, easier to consume. Why is this important? Because when we look at the authorship of Genesis, it's really the authorship of the Pentateuch. So the next 4 messages that I give on the other 4 books of the Pentateuch, you kind of already know what I'm going to say, who the author is. So when we look at books and we're trying to determine who wrote it, often we can go inside that book. There's clues inside that book that give us a clue to who wrote it. We're going to take a look at first, what did Jesus say about the author of Genesis? So when we look at that, we're going to look at Mark 12:26. And Jesus is saying, "Now about the dead rising, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the account of the burning bush, how God said to him, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." So here, Jesus is saying the book of Moses, meaning the book that Moses. Now, you might say, Dave, the burning bush isn't in Genesis, it's in Exodus. And that is very true. But like I just said, the whole book, the Pentateuch, is considered one book back then, anyways. So if Moses wrote Exodus, he also wrote Genesis. And there's about another half dozen or so references that Jesus makes to the book of Moses, or the law of Moses, referencing Moses as the author. So let's jump back to Old Testament references. And we will take a look at 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 3. And it says, "Observe what the Lord your God requires." Now, this is King David saying this. "Walk in obedience to him and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and regulations, as written in the law of Moses." So here, he's not saying that Moses created the laws, like the laws are from Moses. He's saying that Moses wrote the laws down. He's saying he's the author of the Pentateuch, and specifically here, Genesis. let's take a look at one more reference here, and we're going to actually reference Exodus, which is the same book, and for purposes of determining who the author was. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, write this on a scroll as something to be remembered." So these are the type of verses that we really like to see when we're trying to determine who wrote the book that we're trying to interpret. Here's clearly saying the Lord said to Moses, write it down. Right? We can see that Moses was the author of Genesis. Now, as with almost every other single book of the Bible, there's always a little bit of debate on who wrote it. Generally, some other theories that have been offered to list who wrote the books. So there are two main theories, other theories, that people have thought of how Genesis was written. So the first one was by a French physician, Jean Ostrach. Jean suggested that Genesis was a editorial composition, meaning that he looked at in the Pentateuch all the different ways that God was referred to, like Yahweh and Elohim, and all the different ways that the author referenced God. He suggests that each of those is a separate source document. Okay, so he's saying it wasn't just by Moses. Moses was the only author of the Pentateuch. Then the other theory kind of takes that a little bit more defined anyways. It's got a couple of different names. A couple of them are cool, and one of them is kind of lame. JEDP. Just the initials of the 4 books, because this theory says that there's only 4 books in the Pentateuch, not 5. It's also called the documentary hypothesis, and then also Graf Wellhausen Kuhnen, which I think is the cool name. So the first book that it says is J, and it uses the name Yahweh for God. That book was written around the 9th century BC and comes from Judah. E comes from the use of Elohim, and it dates around the 18th century and comes from the Northern Kingdom. D is for Deuteronomy and is supposedly to come from the time of Josiah, or about 621 BC. P is priestly element, which deals with matters of the priesthood and ritual dating back to about 5th century BC. So those are the 2 alternate theories. For this message, we're going to move forward with Moses being the author of Genesis. So let's get into when was Genesis put down on paper. When was it written? When was it documented? So 2 things here. First of all, we need to understand that in Moses' time, the vast majority of history and knowledge was passed down via an oral tradition, orally passed down. This wasn't books. You couldn't go on Amazon and buy the whatever book that you ever wanted, or look on Kindle and read whatever book you wanted in an instant. It was oral traditions. Now, as a side note, you might think, well, that doesn't sound very accurate. I can't even tell you what my wife's phone number is. And I know that the area code is 920, but outside of that, I don't know what it is. But I do remember when I was a child, I knew everybody's phone number. Like when you'd get a new friend and they'd tell you the phone number, they just told you, and you would probably be able to remember it. So in the few decades between my childhood and now, my memory capability of remembering things has gone downhill quite a bit. Now extrapolate that to many, many, many thousands of years ago, when we didn't have all of these devices of remembering things for us, and we had to remember everything on our own. People they would memorize the entire Pentateuch. not just a couple verses. Like I struggle to memorize verses, and there were people back then memorize the entire Old Testament, the Pentateuch. I believe if we were to bring back somebody from that era, we would be absolutely in awe of their ability to memorize word for word documents. So anyways, oral tradition back then, very accurate. That was one thing. The second thing is when we're looking at when things were written, so we're talking about when it was put down on paper or solidified as an oral tradition, as this is a book, this is something that we need to teach to our kids. That's what I'm talking about, not necessarily the dates of the content that's in the book. And so when we're trying to determine that, it is always tied to who we agree who wrote it. So if we agree that Moses wrote Genesis, that puts into a specific time slot. If we agree with the JEDP thesis or the Graf-Wellhausen-Conen theory, that is actually has got a long span from 9th century BC to 5th century BC of when all the documents were committed as these are the documents. So we're moving with Moses. So we're going to be looking at the dates that he could have written it. Okay. And as we go through this survey of the Bible, I can guarantee you, you will never get a date like Genesis was written on October 30th, 1387 BC. Not going to be that specific. When we're looking at the New Testament books, we're probably going to get within, a decade or two of a time range. Some of them might be even shorter time frames than that. And the Old Testament, much longer ago, less extra biblical books to reinforce dates, things of that nature. So the spans might be a little bit bigger, might be a couple hundred years, might be a century or two. But let's look at one way that we would put a date for Genesis. And for that, we will take a look at 1 Kings 6:1. And it says, in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. We have a pretty good date of when that was. Not just because it's not as thousands of years old, but we have extra biblical texts from various different sources that can date that to a fair amount of accuracy. So then we backdate it 480 years, and that's when Moses led people the Israel out of Egypt. So we can sometime around there, but specifically when did Moses write everything? Now he could have written Genesis when he was in exile with the Kenites before he went back to Egypt to free Israel. Parts of the Pentateuch, anyways, could not have been written then, because it documents the stories of them wandering 40 years in the wilderness, specifically going up to Mount Sinai and being with God and getting the 10 Commandments. So, but Genesis could have been written prior to that. So, full transparency is history is not my best subject. You're never going to see me publish a timeline of biblical events. I will share other people's, because there are people that are very gifted at that, very gifted at looking at history, looking at all the extra biblical events and piecing it all together. Now, history isn't as weak as a subject as, say, maybe the English language or grammar or spelling. Those three are my worst by far, things that I really struggle with. But anyways, history, not that great for me, but we can probably look at between the 15th and 13th century of BC as to around when this was done. Could be completely off, and I'm never going to get into a big argument about dates because good chance I'm wrong. So that's when. How about where? Genesis is a pretty unique book when we talk about locations that it covers inside the book. In fact, I think there's might be only one other book that can share the same uniqueness, and that's Revelations. So Genesis covers the creation story where there was no location. It was the creation of locations, the creation of the universe. God. And in Revelations, we see that go away, and then we spend eternity with God and Jesus. So it's kind of a same thing where the location consists of something other than Earth as we know it today. So, two aspects of where in Genesis. Creation of the universe, so like the creation of everything. Genesis covers every location there ever could be. But more specifically, when we start talking about humans, when we get into the Garden of Eden, and then outside of that, it mentions locations like the Ur of the Chaldees, Babel, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Canaan, and other locations, what we would generally consider the Middle East. And today, what are some of the major characters in Genesis? Now, Genesis is a pretty big book. I'm not going to list every single character that's mentioned and categorize that into major or minor, but some of the big hitters obviously is God, right? Yahweh is mentioned. The whole story is about him. The first two chapters, anyway, is about him creating the universe. And then also, which might not be as evident when we read Genesis, but Jesus is a major character also. We can learn that in John when we talk about the in the beginning there was the Word. Everything was created through Jesus. So Jesus was there. He was a major character in Genesis. Some of the other characters, we have Adam and Eve, Cain and Abel, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and then we end up with Joseph. So what are we talking about in Genesis? Genesis got 50 chapters. It has 50 chapters in it. Large book. That's 36,000 words approximately in our modern translations. Interesting to note, in the Hebrew, there's only 32,046 words. Less words. I'd probably be better at speaking Hebrew, less words to mess up. My grammar might be better. Not sure about the spelling. I don't know if you've seen Hebrew. Not easy to spell. So the first two chapters of Genesis, like I said, covers the creation of the universe. And in chapter 2, we're introduced to the first humans, Adam and Eve. Chapter 3 forward is a historical account of the fall, all the way up to the death of Joseph. So basically a lot of years, right? So it spans a significant amount of years. Now, how many years span from the creation of the earth to Joseph, or even to Adam and Eve? So this is a little bit of a side note, getting into the weeds, going down a rabbit hole, and I apologize. I know I said in my last message I would try and keep these, each survey of each book to 15 to 20 minutes, but we're at almost 19 minutes now, and I still have a few pages of notes. So there's a couple rabbit holes I want to be going down. I apologize for the length, but as I do these overviews, I hope it does just provide some context and some things that maybe you haven't thought of previously. Also, when I'm going down these rabbit holes, I do want to emphasize that however you fall, like whether you think it was the 13th century or the 3rd century or whenever you think Genesis was written, or when I want to talk about how old the earth is, you can fall on the old earth or the new earth theory, and I'm okay with it. These aren't subjects that affect your salvation. So we might be getting into some heated arguments with people about certain things, but we need to understand what is going to affect our salvation. And how old the earth is not going to do. But every time that I think about how old earth is, specifically when I'm reading the first couple of chapters of Genesis, right, there's two big theories of it. And I always picture this huge table with a lot of biblical scholars, and they're having Thanksgiving dinner with their closest friend. And I think this topic is one of those things that will end up in a food fight. Not going to end up nice. It's going to have some heated, high volume conversations for sure. So on one side, you have the young earth. They believe that the timeline laid out in the Bible is what it is. So they believe between 6,000 and 8,000 years old is how old Earth and the universe is. There's another theory, which I think people believe is the more scientific theory, that it's millions of years old. Archaeology and all of that, we look at carbon dating and all these other evidences that it's millions and millions of years old. Now, again, history is not my strongest suit. I think there are very, very intelligent people that have spent a lot of time researching both sides of it. And I've seen some videos, read some papers on both sides. Both have very compelling arguments. At the end of the day, again, this is one of those questions that it's on my list to ask Jesus when I see him. So, could be many thousands of years, could be millions of years, but I kind of wager that Genesis spans about 2,500 years. I guess you kind of can see what side of the fence that I fall on. Okie dokie. So continuing with some of the highlights, again, at 50 chapters, I'm not going to be able to highlight every single chapter, every single fact and thing that happens in Genesis, but that's not the point. Big picture overview of Genesis is what we're going with. And I apologize if I left out your favorite biblical story. I've left out a few of mine, but I've also included some of my favorite ones in here. So, like I said, first few chapters, God created the universe. And I get to this point again because many years ago I was in a discussion with some people about animals. And specifically, so let's set the story, the record straight. I'm not anti-animals. I'm not anti-pets. I love pets. Specifically, I love other people's pets. I love going and visiting people that have pets so I can pet the dogs, spend some time with cats. I do like cats. I'm just not a big person that wants to have pets of my own at all. I might make an exception for a pig. If I could get my wife to agree to have a pet pig, I think that would be the pet that I would have. Seeing as it's not going to happen in my lifetime anyways, it's safe to say that there's going to be no pets. If you come to my house, I'm not going to have pets, right? But the discussion that I was having with these people were about the how valuable animals' lives are compared to human life. And more specifically, do animals have souls? What does that mean? Are animals going to go to heaven? When your pet dies, does he go to heaven? Do all dogs go to heaven? I don't know. Again, one of those questions that we'll have answered when we get to heaven. But this is what we're going to take a look at. We're going to take a look at two verses in Genesis specifically. The first verse is Genesis 1:30. And to all the beasts of the earth, and all the birds in the sky, and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. And it was basically saying, hey, anything, every animal, every creature can eat plants, right? Now we go to Genesis 2:7. Then the Lord God formed a man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And the man became a living being. So in both of these verses, we see the breath of life, right? So animals have the breath of life, and so do humans. And I take those four words, the breath of life, meaning that we have a soul. That is what God breathed into us. The breath of life is the soul, meaning that when we pass away, we'll either get to go to heaven or to hell. hopefully heaven, if you believe that Jesus is your Lord. So I believe animals do go to heaven based on this. And you might say, Dave, maybe, but what happens if the translators of Genesis, they weren't like you? They really loved pets, and they wanted to make sure that pets got to heaven. So they translated something to make it sound like they had a soul, just like humans have a soul. And that's a valid concern. I think as we interpret the Bible, we need to, it's a critical question to have. Did the translators translate it properly? Right? Especially when we're comparing different verses. How do we really do that? Right? We do that using what's called the Strong's. Strong's is an index of Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek words that are in the Bible, and it just lists out that each single word it lists out, gives it a number. In this case, it's a phrase, the breath and of the life. They have numbers. Right? So every time in the Bible that the Hebrew or Greek or Aramaic, the original language in those, you can see for the breath, the Strong's number of H5397, and of the life, H2416. So we can take those pieces of reference and we can see that both Genesis 1:30 and Genesis 2:7 have both H5397 and H2416. So we can rest assured that the translators of Genesis 1:30 weren't just pet lovers, they were actually translating accurately. One of the other benefits of using Strong's is then we can see how was it translated in other areas of the Bible, right? So we can, it's very helpful to, when we're trying to translate, when we're trying to answer difficult questions, when we get down into it, we can take a look and see, hey, this is, for example, one word might appear 300 times in the Bible. And Strong's will give you, say, hey, 72% of the time it was translated as this English word or phrase, and 18% of the time it was translated this way, right? So it's a good way to understand that words, just like in the English language, Hebrew, Greek, Aramaic, all those other languages could have multiple meanings and be taken different ways. And it's important to know the context that it was used to help determine what the meaning was. So all this to say is I do believe that animals are in heaven. Alrighty, so let's get past that one. We can't talk about creation without talking about the fall, where Adam and Eve ate the apple, right? Now this is one more rabbit hole, and I believe it's the last one for today's message anyways. So was it really an apple that Adam and Eve ate? But at the end of the day, again, this is not a topic that's going to affect your salvation. You believe it's an apple or you believe it's a different fruit. That's not going to affect your salvation, so let's not get too serious about it. But interesting, the Bible doesn't say what type of fruit it is. It doesn't say that they ate an apple. But how did we get to an apple? I mean, if we look at what fruit is most common in that area that we believe the Garden of Eden was at, it would most likely be a fig, in my opinion, or a grape. Anyways, how did it become an apple? We take a look at the work of Azan Yadin Israel. He's a professor of Jewish studies and classics at the School of Arts and Sciences at Rutgers University. And this, I want to use this also at the end as a wonderful example of context, and how important it is as we interpret the Bible. Okay, so there's two common explanations. They're pretty similar. One of them, it says, starting around the 17th century, scholars started to say that the Latin started to give this as a reason why it's an apple. The Latin word for apple is malum. Didn't pronounce that right. I'm very certain of it. It's M-A-L-U-M. And it's a homonym for evil, meaning that same word, M-A-L-U-M, means apple, and it also means evil. Right? So since the fruit that they ate caused us to be banished from the Garden of Eden, it's easy for us to assign that fruit as evil. When we're talking about the evil fruit, it's just easy to take the other meaning of the word malum as apple, and voila, it was an apple that they ate. Okay, but Azan spent a lot of time researching, much more time than I have. Luckily, he did a very well, a wonderful write-up of this, and I was able to read that and present it to you here. But Azan looked at the medieval Latin commentaries on the book of Genesis, like all of them. Pretty much all of the commentaries on Genesis in the medieval times, he looked at, and he could not see this play on words. It just wasn't in anything that people were writing about Genesis. They didn't mix the two words up together. And even as far as the 14th century, they were still referring, for the most part, the fruit as a fig or a grape. Again, how did we get to apple? So if we look at two things, which again, this is, so if you were wondering, if I were to go back to college and I were to go get a degree, the last degree that I would ever try and obtain, undergraduate or graduate degree, would be a degree in historical linguistics. It is not something that I'm going to at all. We're not even trying for that. But we look at the historical linguistics, meaning the evolution of language over time. Okay, so if we look at the historical evolution of specifically the French language. Okay, so we look at Latin authors in the commentaries most commonly refer to the forbidden fruit as pomum, P-O-M-U-M, a Latin word meaning fruit, or specifically tree fruit. So, Old French, there's three kind of versions of French. There's Old French, Middle French, and New French. Old French, which derives its language from Latin, has the word pomme, P-O-M. Now, modern for New French, it's spelled P-O-M-M-E, but it's the same word, P-O-M. And that meant fruit as well in the earliest of the Old French language. Now, that went to about Old French language, ended around the 1300s AD, and then Middle French took over, and then around the 17th and 18th centuries is when the New French really took hold. So, Old French, you read Adam and Eve ate a pomme, ate a P-O-M, and using Old French, which, as a side note, was generally one of the most important languages during that time up until about the 20th century. French language was very important in politics and history and of the day. So we look at Old French, Adam and Eve ate a pomme, they would think Adam and Eve ate a fruit. Now, over time, the meaning of that word changed from Old French to New French. What do you think it means in New French? New French, it means apple. So when people read Adam and Eve ate a pomme, they wouldn't read that, interpret that as Adam and Eve ate a fruit. They would see Adam and Eve ate an apple. So that is, I believe, how most people believe that it was an apple that Adam and Eve ate. Okay. Enough rabbit holes. Let's get to it. The next couple of chapters deal with the fall, and then they moves on to Cain and Abel. In chapter 5, we get to the first section of genealogy, from Adam to Noah. And I know you might be rolling your eyes, you might be taking a sigh of genealogies, yuck. And I'm very guilty of that as well. And I take a look at that, and what do? I try and read as quickly as I can to just get through it. That's what I used to do anyway. What I try and do now, and what I would encourage others to do, is just to take a deep breath and realize that the genealogies are in here and included for a reason. Now, when I read genealogies now, is I try and study and look for patterns within the genealogies. Not necessarily, again, trying to memorize dates and who was whose descendants. I try and look at certain patterns, and oftentimes I can get little pieces of nugget information. I think First and Second Kings is a good example of that, as it goes through the history of the kings of Israel and Judah. I did a Excel sheet based on that, and I was correlating whether the Bible referenced them as a good king or bad king, to if it also said if they had counselors, if they followed the counsel of the wise people, or they didn't. So, and in Proverbs, it talks about how a good, wise person seeks many counselors. If you want to be a good leader, considered a good king or a good leader, make sure you seek out wise counsel from multiple people. So now we move on to Noah and the flood, and then we get to the Tower of Babel. And in chapter 11, we get to one of the major characters. And it's a large chunk of Genesis. Almost 25% of the book, from chapters 11 to chapter 25, is about Abram or Abraham. And then from chapters 25 to 37, it covers the children of Abraham. And in 37, we get to Joseph. And ultimately, in chapter 50, we end with Joseph's death. Now, Joseph is one of my favorite stories in the Bible. I think it's amazing what he went through in his life and how he remained faithful to God. He never lost faith, always sought God out, and was faithful. So he went from his siblings trying to kill him and then selling him off into slavery, to then being put into jail, and then ultimately becoming the second most powerful person in Egypt. And then when his brothers came back into his life, he had the power to give them food so they could remain alive, to sustain their lives, or they could have put him in jail. Joseph could have thrown his entire family in jail, thrown the key out, but no one would have said anything. He could have even had them killed at that point. But instead, he redeemed himself with his family and eventually brought his family down to Egypt because of the famine in Canaan, and even reunited with his father Jacob. I just think it's amazing. It's a great, great story. But that's where we end in Genesis, is the death of Joseph. And that is where we're going to end today's message. I hope it helped you, give you a little bit overview of Genesis, and hope you hit the subscribe button and then also the little alarm button so you know when the next message on Exodus comes out, and we continue with a Bible survey to give you a big picture view of the Bible in hopes to help you on your daily basis apply the Word of God to your daily lives. Thank you. God bless.